welcome everyone to our 6th Data Salon for 2020. This is our holiday special as we conclude the year. And I want to thank everyone for joining us for the last several data salons that we've had. As a reminder to folks, these are non-attribution data salons where we're discussing how we can actually approach data science and what it does in the world with a social purpose that actually improves the world. I want to also give thanks to our partners at Accenture for also co-partnering and co-hosting to make this happen. I want to turn first to Stephen, who has some initial remarks as the co-host for the Data Salon before we go to our discussants. Stephen, over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bray. And I want to welcome everyone here. It's so lovely. I just love your background. It's kind of in the theme. I wore my beautiful Christmas sweater. Beautiful might be subjective. And you know, we like to open these, and I'm just so happy to see so many return friends here. So Sabrina, Sean, Jen, you know, welcome, and many others as well. We like to start these out, you know, kind of talking a little bit about where we came from and where we're headed. And part of that is, you know, really that everyone here is a practitioner. We have a background of understanding. We have a professional decorum amongst us. And we can have a discussion that we might not be able to have in other venues. Of course, we all like to do it with drinks afterwards, and we're all hoping we get back there in 2021. And we also like to talk about the notion that we're dedicated to inclusion and diversity and ensuring that everyone we work with feels that they belong. As part of that, we do not tolerate any kind of racism, misogyny, misinformation, exclusion, or any other form of hate. And we refuse to let our work be a platform for those views. We do have those views because it makes our work better and it is the right thing to do. And we have a community of peers here whom we respect and trust, and we look to all of you to hold us accountable to those values. And you know, please feel free to give us feedback, whether we solicit it or not. And also be encouraged to reach out for other reasons. If there's, you know, topics that you want to see discussed, themes, speakers, you know, however that works, you know, please don't be shy about reaching out, and especially ones that could improve the work toward our values and make us more inclusive and diverse. Please let us know. And with that, I'm happy to, I'm actually really excited to end this year talking about digital identity. I think it just is an area that gives a lot of concrete focus to many of the themes that we've talked about in the past, and can really, hopefully, shed some light onto how technology and ethics is working toward giving people an identity of belonging in place and a contributor to civil society. Thank you so much.
Very well said, Stephen. And I think, like you said, with digital identity about having a sense of place and belonging, it's very appropriate at the end of holidays that we consider this. And with digital identity, Scott David made a remark that also we all seem to like each other, which is part of the Data Salon too. So we welcome part of the fellowship together as we map this way forward. So I want to go first to Sheila. Sheila, real quick, could you introduce yourself and give us your initial thoughts, digital identity? Why is it so hard? I mean, we all know we need to do it, but why is it so hard and what can we do about it? Over to you, Sheila.
Thanks, David. Hi, everyone. I'm Sheila Warren. It's great to be here. I am the head of data, blockchain, and digital assets at the World Economic Forum, and I'm based in San Francisco. And this topic is one that's really close to my heart. I mean, I think we can just start off by saying this pandemic has not had many silver linings, but one thing that I think is a silver lining is how it spotlighted, number one, inequity in our systems, and also just places where we're falling down in terms of our tech stack. Like, where is the actual technology that we're using serving to wind up driving more inequality or exclusion? And I think that one of the most critical areas is digital identity. And the reality is, look, we should have solved this problem when we built the internet, and we didn't. So great, fine, it was a miss, you know, but let's move forward from there. What can we do about it now? Well, what we're doing about it now, unfortunately, in my view, is building siloed identity structures. Like, we're basically building, so many people are working on this stuff. This is like one of the hottest things that people aren't necessarily talking about in this way, but it's what they're doing. And the problem is that because there is clearly going to be a tremendous amount of money in whichever company winds up able to most effectively monetize these systems, they are, the builds are, they're siloed, they're not focusing on interoperability, they're focusing really on almost like this a winner takes all mentality, which shouldn't be surprising, and it isn't surprising, but it is also exactly wrong. In my view, it is just exactly wrong. So what I find really interesting is, this isn't that hard, because I think it's important to start there as well. This isn't like, I'm like rocket science and hard, like a lot of things that are hard, right? This isn't as hard as like figuring out how COVID-19 spreads. That's turned out to be really, really hard, hasn't it? It's not that hard. And the reasons that we're making it so hard and we're not getting to a solution that is universal are really political, reasons. And I don't mean political just in terms of geopolitics, so that's a big part of this. I mean in terms of the ownership that people want to have over the solution. The other thing that I'll say is, this is about incumbents giving up control. So to the extent that we've certainly seen systems where we've had mass adoption of digital identity. The example everyone's going to cite, and I love going first in these things, I get to take all the right, is Aadhaar in India. So great rollout, big success, right? But like, how did that happen? Because basically you couldn't like do things like buy vegetables or, get access to water without using this system. Is that what we want to do? Your mileage may vary and opinions differ. So there's a lot to chat about here, and I'm thrilled to be here, and I'm looking forward to hearing what the other discussants and everyone else has to say.
Real quick, and I appreciate it, Sheila. Before we go on to the next discussant, you talked about, is that what we want to do? So we clearly have a need that will present itself with the vaccinations coming out and with COVID-19 and demonstrating this. So do you see that possibly as the final, I mean, obviously we don't want to exclude people that choose not to use digital identity to prove they've gotten their vaccination, but could that be possibly the burning platform that finally gets the United States and others on board with digital identity? What are your thoughts?
So again, I think that the way it's working right now is it's being tied to passports and being tied to crossing a border. Well, who are the people who are first going to cross borders when it comes time to reopen? Right? There's going to be I worry we're going to have eventually another form of caste system around travel, and then around identity, where the assumption is, well, everyone has a passport. No, they don't. Everyone's going to go through an airport. No, they're not. And so if you're not going through those systems, then you're not going to have maybe the default automatic granting of this credential that is then going to be ported into everything else, where before you know it, you can't use an ATM, you can't buy groceries, you can't use your food stamps, you can't do any of this stuff, your WIC, unless you have it, but you have to go through this huge other process of government issued ID around international travel to get it. That can't be right? That just can't be right. And yet that's what we're moving towards, because everyone understands that the COVID-19 situation is critical, that getting people moving again is important to the global economy. I'm not denying any of that, but that is a very exclusive and elite percentage of the population that is going to be taking that path, right? So my concern is that what we build for that system, which can be built quickly, is going to require such expenditure of assets by an individual to access or to obtain that it's going to wind up being super limiting. And then that's going to form the basis for the global identity system. And I find that troubling and problematic.
Very well said. And so I'm now going to real quick do a pivot to Dakota before I go to Dave, because I know, Dakota, you said you had something to add on about the adoption of COVID vaccine certification. So Dakota, your thoughts.
Sure. So hi all, I'm Dakota Gruner. I'm the Executive Director of ID 2020, which is a public-private partnership focused on digital ID. So this is what we think about all day, every day. And I actually want to pick up on two of Sheila's comments. And I think the first is around the sort of siloed and non-interoperable sort of place that we find ourselves in. And really what I think Sheila's talking about is the need for standards. That we have lots of organizations going about developing solutions that they think are the absolute best. And the problem is that without sort of the underlying standards, we're in a position where none of those are particularly interoperable with one another, and where there isn't any real transparency around how these solutions differ and how they meet the sort of functional requirements that all of us as, individuals and individuals invested in having good digital ID care about. And so it's, I'm happy to talk about sort of the work that we've done around the ID 2020 certification, the intent of which is to, help define these functional outcomes-based requirements and put guardrails around some of these solutions, but also to incentivize the solution providers to actually standardize around a set of standards. So we can kind of come back to that. But on the vaccine certification side of things, I think that Sheila's entirely correct that a lot of the momentum that we see at the moment is worryingly focused on travel. But I'm actually really optimistic about a few things. The first is that WHO has stepped into a, sort of they've picked up the mantle of smart vaccination certificates. And they are busy working on technical standards for what should be a smart vaccination certificate. And we've been working closely with them to kind of roll the ID 2020 certification requirements into that. But the way that they're thinking about it is very much through the lens of the COVAX facility. And so Gavi and WHO and others who have a fundamental focus on inclusion and saying, how do we ensure that these vaccines reach everyone, are busy thinking through what will it take for a smart vaccination certificate to be rolled out alongside the vaccine, across the world. And I think one of the things that, it's heartening to see WHO working on that. It's particularly exciting to see them enshrining into the design principles a focus on privacy and decentralization and multiple different, solution providers being brought to bear. I think where we're lacking at the moment, and this is sort of personal sentiment, is the data on how these solutions actually work in practice. There's lots of organizations who've said we have a perfect solution. Here's our POC. It's great. But if you're a government, and particularly a developing government, developing country government at the moment, you don't know how costly it's going to be to roll one of these things out. You don't know what it's going to take to sustain. And so I think one of the sort of gaps that I see right now is less on the technical side and more on the operational side of, how will a country decide they want to opt in and roll one of these out, and where do they get the data to inform how they do so?
Very well said. And I appreciate you particularly highlighting that it seems like the barrier right now is the cost and the economics of scaling, that we can have proofs of concepts, but the economic scaling. Are you seeing any, real quick before we go to Esther, Dakota, are you seeing any early proof points of success where people are able to demonstrate economic scaling, or things that you want to highlight to the group as this was what we need more of in that area?
What I'm seeing is just a lack of sort of structured monitoring and evaluation. So we're seeing proof of concepts, and particularly I think many of them are travel oriented, or people are being able to say, we are, we're successfully piloting one of these solutions. And most of these at the moment, of course, are focused on test results rather than on a vaccination certificate. But, we've successfully gotten somebody to get tested in Heathrow, get off the plane in JFK, and be able to prove their test results on arrival. That is an important proof of concept. It doesn't speak to at scale, how much is this going to cost? What are going to be the benefits for, particularly a government as they're trying to, fund a whole lot of important things as part of the pandemic response.
Very helpful. I appreciate it. So Dave, we are going to come to you, but Esther has a real quick rejoinder. So Esther, you have a question you wanted to ask?
It's less a rejoinder, more a complication.
Complication, welcome.
I'm on the board of the Commons Project, which is the organization behind Common Pass, and they have a relationship with World Economic Forum. So, I don't know how much the first speaker is connected with this, but to me, the issue is very much not the cost, which is actually quite small. And I know it's price levels are different in India and so forth, but it's, compared to the cost of the vaccination, it's a nit. And I think, the first question is, can you afford the vaccination or the test? The second question is, do you want to take it? And the third question is you're taking it coercive? And it's one thing, I have to take this vaccination to get on a flight and go to some other country. That sort of seems fairly legitimate. Do you need it to go to your job? And so that it's like we need to go much further down the path towards what is informed consent, what is freely given consent versus coercive consent. And those are where the real issues are. But the COVID-19, it's as if suddenly everybody was carrying a gun in their pocket that they didn't necessarily want to have. And that's why this is such an inflamed conversation, because people really are dangerous. And the person who wants their liberty also, needs to worry about the grandmother they might kill by mistake if their gun goes off. But the other challenge is that we're not, we were talking about the wording, and it's, I don't want to have to carry this passport so everybody knows who I am.
Right.
You're right. You want to carry the passport so that they can ask you the specific question of were you or were you not vaccinated. It's kind of like, and there's this guy, Jeff Jonas, who started out doing this. In the casinos in Las Vegas, if you're a known felon, you can't come in. And they don't care who you are. They just want to know, are you a known felon or not? Are you over 18 or not? And that, as Dakota was saying, depends very, very much on how all this stuff is implemented. What are the rules? The technology is just some underpinning, but what are you required to do? What are you required to know, et cetera? And I'm just commenting, so I'll stop there, but just, it's pretty complicated. I'm glad we're having this discussion.
Yep, it sounds like definitely, and I hear what you're saying. You want to have a resostat where you don't necessarily reveal your total identity, you just prove that you've had the test. But it is complicated. So that's a great segue to Dave, because assume all these complications. You now get to solve it. So Dave, your open remarks as to why haven't we implemented digital identity at scale yet? Your turn.
Yeah, I'm trying. Sorry, you just threw me. I had my opening well in mind, but you've tossed another interesting wrinkle to it. So sorry, Dave Treat. I lead Accenture's multi-party systems and blockchain team, of which digital identity is one of our 3 primary focus areas, and we're involved, just about every, we're involved with just about every aspect and domain, from standards writing to, I sit on the board of ID 2020 with Dakota. I work with Sheila in the C4IR Center. We work with the Commons, project as well. We're involved with governments and the like. And so I guess maybe I'll answer the why in a second, but maybe as a circuitous route to it. And to some of the questions, I think that the chain that's going in the text chat, I thought Danielle started an interesting question around control and privacy. One of the things I've been most encouraged about in this whole space is that where this originated from, or the most recent, the current wave of it originated from, right, is from a space of really introducing the whole notion of self-managed identity and having that privacy and control, and really creating, and I'm going to frame it very carefully, creating a valuable added option to the hybrid nature of the different identity constructs that we live in, right? I don't think there's anyone who's going to, I think it's a hard argument to make that national identities will go away, right? State Department, a passport, you have national sovereign identity systems, but then you typically have had the private enterprise business model being based on harvesting information off of a network that they've built, and the winning digital business was the one who could glean the most information about the individual to then apply machine learning algorithms to hyper-personalized offers, et cetera. And all the frustrations that then we've then had as a society around that is that data use appropriate, inappropriate? We're all certainly tired of the data theft, data hack, data breach, but we've also all kind of given up on being able to regain that notion of privacy. And so I've been incredibly encouraged by this wave. Started with the W3C standard, the Digital Identity Foundation, the open source platforms being built in the Linux Hyperledger, Indian Aries, the whole open source, open ecosystem, principle-based approach that says, actually, we can introduce another alternative to the agency model. And that being this whole notion of self-managed identity. And I think that's incredibly powerful. And if I try to bridge the previous conversation around the current health vaccination space and some of what both Sheila, Dakota, I think was Esther, I lost the name.
Yeah, Esther, it was Esther.
That whole space, there have been a proliferation of solutions that are coming out that unfortunately too many of them are perpetuating the agency model. So they're providing a valuable benefit and service of, I can now manage this certification and be able to show it to authorities or service providers to be able to do and get what I need. But if it's in the agency model, we really have taken a wild right-hand turn in where this innovation wave needs to get to. Because now you run the risk of what else is that data used for? How's it managed? You're now trusting that agency to protect it, to care for it, and that's the old model. And so, part of what we're really looking towards is how do we create that pragmatic hybrid model of, the existing national sovereign identity systems, plus introducing notions of self-managed constructs where valuable and appropriate. How does that all work together? And now to finally get to your question around why it hasn't come to scale is all of those contexts, whether it's financial inclusion, whether it's health, whether it's whether it's benefits distribution, government services, each one of these ecosystems have different needs and requirements and stakeholders and regulations and laws and policies. And so the technology's there. It really is not what's holding us up. It's the very hard work around creating those agreements around the social choices societal choices we want to make, humanistic, policy, regulatory, legal choices around the ecosystems. And the way I see it playing out are connected islands of implementation that will have a successful travel use case, we'll have a successful health vaccine use case, we'll have a successful benefits distribution use case. And if they're all built to the same open standard and an open ecosystem where multiple parties can win, then the individual wins because they can go from that island of implementation and traverse them and have an effective digital identity. If they're each independently operated and interoperability takes the form of come to my platform, then we're in for a rough ride.
Very well said, Dave. And so maybe as a quick rejoinder, maybe a two-part question. The first part is would it be correct to say that what makes digital identity powerful is if we make sure it's about the individual having a locus of choice about when and where they present it? And then the second question on that then, though, is this possibly one of the reasons why it hasn't been implemented? Does this challenge the existing platforms that want you to come to them?
Yeah, that's exactly the challenge. And I think obviously, a number of dynamics at play, right? Valuable service wins, right? Usability wins. Usability wins, but often the whole notion of the risk profile can be hidden for a little bit of time until, so you can have a agency-based, highly usable model. And then, 6 months down the road, you realize you've just given your entire set of data to yet another private enterprise that's going to, have either misuse or data hack. So, usability is important. Functionality is important, but having and now I'm going to channel Sheila. I'm going to channel forum language. The effective multi-stakeholder community that can have that consumer advocacy, legal, regulatory, ethics. We need the group to create the framework to make sure that these solutions are being built in a way that's going to maximize the value of what this innovation wave can create and not perpetuate the old model.
Very well said. All right, so now I want to go to Dante, also one of our main discussants. So Dante, you've heard a lot. What's your perspective both on what are the challenges in this space and what are the opportunities when it comes to digital IDs in 2021?
Sure. So, well, hi, everyone. I'm Dante Disparte. I have I'll come at tonight's conversation with the three hats that I wear because I think they would be relevant. So I'm a senior executive with the now newly rebranded DM Association, looking at this question of financial inclusion and digital currencies and payments, for which the identity nexus is massively important to address financial inclusion and clearing a process of KYC, know your customer. But I'd also like to start with the other hat that I wear, which is looking at it from the lens of risk and resilience. So I'm a reformed entrepreneur in the risk and insurance domain, and I serve on FEMA's National Advisory Council. So looking at it very much contextually in the response that we have mounted to COVID-19 right now. So starting with the vulnerability, so many people thinking back to the Equifax breach are born, if you're born in the right postal code and you win the national birth lottery, you're born with an alphanumeric identifier in your social security number that is in so many ways in our traditional economy, your gateway to getting access to credit. And that identifier is then put into these honeypot single source, single point of failure databases that will then make determinations on your credit score and the rest. And so when you think about the Equifax breach that exposed for the rest of your natural life, 150 plus million people, largely in the United States, roughly the size of the entire US workforce, to identity theft risk for the rest of their natural life, it then raises important questions about optionality and resilience, right? So what David described, what Dakota and Sheila described, are the various different ways it can show up. But where I think of identity and technology as game changing is that we can always look in hindsight at where we were vulnerable ex post facto, right? In the same way that the Treasury stimulus bill, the CARES Act, called for the creation of a digital dollar or a digital wallet as fundamental infrastructure to speed up payments domestically. The void reveals the gap, right? That if we're relying singularly as an economy on analog infrastructure to transfer value, or analog infrastructure or alphanumeric infrastructure that's insecure, like a social security number, to identify people, then in the context of stress, you realize where you have a gap. And similarly, in the context of stress, you can't buy insurance when your house is on fire. Mm-hmm. And so all of these good ideas, COVID-19 has been the proof point for we have to come out of the lab. And COVID-19 similarly has been the proof point that technology is no longer the issue. The issue, frankly, is a gap in public policy. The issue, frankly, or a lot of the issues we're discussing tonight, is that we're trying to completely de-risk technological approaches when the void of them is the problem. Think about how important, how critical the internet has been, and those so fortunate again to have a Zoom account in terms of business and operational and household continuity for every single thing that we do, including tonight's discussion. And so when you come at it from that lens of these are solutions for fundamental resilience in business and national and household continuity problems, then you have to solve for how do you ensure that they're ubiquitous? How do you ensure that their first principles around privacy, security, openness, et cetera, are not seen as trade-offs, and that you expand that perimeter of authentication, of access, and of these very basic building blocks of a global economy where our money goes to sleep, it's not internet ready, we take banking holidays when you want to get access to fundamental services, and we have no way of assuring at population scale very secure ways of identifying ourselves. And the only use cases we try to solve for speedily are the ones that are frankly novelty use cases, like travel, boarding a plane, et cetera. And we have to solve for the use case that is ultimately the one being funded by us when all other systems fail. Last I checked, the $5+ trillion intervention is one borne by taxpayers. We're paying for it. And yet we're propping up zombie industries, we're propping up frankly, dated and vulnerable business models that are heavily centralized, and you and I as taxpayers are paying for it. So I think the fundamental public policy conversation that should have continued post-Equifax and didn't, and fell short, they got away with a slap on the wrist approach, should be that a digital identity or some form of secure internet-ready authentication should be a public policy priority backed by the government, supported by private sector innovation, but done so in a manner that gives people irrevocable self-sovereignty and control of their identity and authentication. Those on-ramps into the 21st century are going to be a key for long-range competitiveness and a key for long-range security, but the void of them is a massive vulnerability today. And now looking at it in the post-COVID world, and this will be my final point, we're literally going to live in two worlds. Think about it in the US context, where freedom and security have always been trade-offs. And the fear of wearing a mask means that all of the rest of us were exposed because of a simple individual choice. And now that choice is going to be worked in the inverse. If you don't have the ability to prove successful vaccination at high assurance, you're going to be barred from boarding a private aircraft. You're going to be barred from entering a movie theater. And there will literally be two Americas as a result of this. So the fundamental question is hard to solve that in the middle of a crisis. But the crisis does prove out the use point and the case in point that everybody has discussed thus far.
Very well said, Dante. And if I liked how you said that, one, we need to point out that the risk of not doing something is actually even worse than trying to downplay all the risk. If I could ask you a real quick rejoinder, given we have a new administration coming in, if you could make one recommendation for what they try to tackle in the first 100 days, yeah, what would be your recommendation to them?
So David, let me, because you picked up on that risk question, right? In the financial inclusion case, we literally have a global compliance system that for fear of one brown person making an errant payment, whole continents and billions of people are financially excluded. That's a policy choice in the same way that it is a policy choice in the United States of America not to have free, basic, portable banking to the individual. Tech is no panacea, right? I've never believed tech is a panacea. Tech just highlights the areas where policy and regulatory issues have failed to deliver 21st century excuses for why we no longer change. My one message to the Biden administration, and I have a long form article or white paper out there called The Great Correction, would be to fix the things that broke the first and the fastest in this pandemic, because those are the areas that will improve post-pandemic resilience. Ubiquity of internet access, ubiquity of access to fundamental systems and healthcare surge capacity and the rest would be the things that we have to address in the first 100 days early on if we have any confidence that the pandemic is behind us.
Very well said, and that resonates with some things we've had in earlier data salons, that we almost have to start with the Maslow hierarchy of needs. And like you said, if we're not connected, and if everyone doesn't have ubiquity of access, then everything else is unfortunately exclusionary. I'm going to real quick go to our initial discussants before I pivot then to Daniel and Sheila, who had some questions and some comments. But first, Dave, Sheila, Dakota, if you have any additional comments that you want to say here before we go to other people with questions.
Maybe to just amplify a piece of what Dante just talked about, that we've been spending, we collectively have been spending some good amount of time on around that financial inclusion, right? Dante's spot on in terms of what the pandemic has highlighted and what has been brought to the fore. But if you just look at the longstanding challenge of the banking deserts, even in a country like the U.S., and when you look at from a financial inclusion perspective, the identification requirements to be onboarded to financial services when you're sitting in a banking desert, are just egregious, right? Let alone now to Dante's point, take the COVID context where, in quarantine, jogging down to the bank branch with documentation that you may or may not have to be able to then, adequately identify yourself to then be onboarded into financial services, even worse. And so, I'm incredibly encouraged that the discussions have started and the technologies there and the discussions have started around the policy choices to say, yes, my remote town may not have a bank, but obviously banks can be digital. Obviously, let's say you can also have internet access. My town may not have a bank, but if it has a pharmacy, it's got a supply store, it's got a Walmart, it's got some other components. That ability to rethink our policies around what valid identification and identity entails, and to be able to collect verifiable credentials from that pharmacist who looked at your driver's license to validate you got the right, for the right prescription, the supply store that, the person that knows you, that ability to rethink that threshold and standard for requirements for financial inclusion for populations that have been so egregiously excluded. This provides a platform to start to think and do those kinds of things, and I think I think what we're all highlighting is that there are just so many different facets to the potential, and because the technology is there, I think just it's the combo of frustration and excitement that we can get there, and we're not getting there fast enough.
Very well said. All right, Sheila, do you have anything?
I think that you've heard a lot of what I would have added. I really want to highlight this idea that because we are focusing so much on a very specific use case around vaccination, namely travel, namely cross-border travel. I think we just have to really acknowledge what I loved how Dante called it a novelty use case. It really is. And because of that, the consequences of that could well be quite profound. And I think that Dante, we already see that we are just focusing for the moment on the United States. We are already very much, two Americas, and this narrative is really nothing new. If we become yet another split or schism into our society because of the access that we're granting around things like this that should be really fundamental, it's not good, to put it to kind of just put it as basically as I can. It's just not good.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing to, while certainly this novelty use case is the one that's sort of top of mind for, most of us at the moment, I don't think we should cut the efforts that have been going on around use cases that are much less sort of niche. And, I think it's interesting for us, we have been focused on actually the intersection of vaccination and digital ID for a long time, but came at it long before the pandemic from precisely the angle of inclusion. So when we broaden the lens and think about digital ID on a global level, there are a billion people who have no form of identification whatsoever. 89% of those are live in Gavi eligible countries. So they live in low income countries where Gavi is providing vaccines. And in almost every one of those countries, the vaccination coverage rates are higher than the birth registration rates. And so if you can figure out how to equip community health workers, who are going door to door, who are spending time, they literally have these infants in their arms as they're providing these vaccines, the same, what is a niche use case for a vaccination certificate for a, person who's traveling from London to Heathrow, it actually might be that very, very similar construct around, a digital vaccination certificate for kids and routine immunization, if taken to scale by Gavi in every one of these countries, is a route to close the, this digital ID gap that frankly, I don't think exists anywhere else.
Very well said. I appreciate that, Koa. And I think that actually does tie into a question and some comments that actually first, Daniel. Daniel Mintz, would you be willing to sort of build upon some of the comments you were putting in the chat, please, Daniel?
I was so happy just typing in the chat.
Well, you can if you want to, but we just want to give you a chance to read your thoughts.
So I'm Dan Mintz. I'm currently a department chair of information technology at the University of Maryland Global Campus. And of course, I knew David when we were both CIOs in the federal government years ago. So I had two things. I mean, they're sort of a disparate. I mean, first of all, the conversation is very interesting. I had two general comments. One is, though it maybe as a distraction, to some extent, some of the issues, to me, some of the issues around privacy and things like that depend on an agreement as to the relationship of the legal structure and government need. And most of us are used to one kind of structure, but that's not true globally. There are many places where the legal structure is subservient in some more fashion to government, which I'm just saying is an issue when you're looking at international agreements and things like that. An example I used even in the US, there's been this continuing argument from law enforcement, FBI, that they want to have backdoors built into software. Well, if you have backdoors built into, but this is a very serious argument going on. If you have backdoors built into software, then privacy is not so private. At the end of the day, it doesn't work. The other thing is, and this is just a side thing that came up there, somebody had mentioned insurance. I've been struck over the last decade, insurance is a great mechanism to quantify risk. One of the big issues I know when I was a CIO was how do you quantify risk in a way that you can make intelligent investment decisions? I mean, it's not so easy to do. The insurance process and companies that are used to doing insurance are a great way of quantifying risk. And it seems to me we could do stuff utilizing that capability to do more of that risk quantification, which would make a lot of these discussions more manageable. So, anyway. Well
said. I don't know if any of our discussants want to give a rejoinder to that. Any thoughts?
Yeah, if I could. I love that. Sorry, go Dante.
Go Dante.
Sorry, I was just going to pick up on the insurance point briefly, because I think it's an important issue. So there are two conundrums right now that everybody likens data to being the new oil. And if it is in fact the new oil, perhaps blockchain is its new barrel. The challenge is that we do not have a gap compliant or gap conforming way. And by that, I mean generally acceptable generally accepted accounting principles, gap conforming way of valuing data. Right. So for what the insurers do, and I've spent a lot of time with cyber insurance and breach response insurance before it was a thing. What the insurers do is they take every record, every PII, personally identifiable record, and they value the cost of breach notification to the company that is insured, not the economic damage or personal or other damage caused to the individual whose data was exposed. That's still an externality in the system and completely unincorporated in the cost of these issues. And so that's the public policy nexus, right? Is that we as public policy leaders have to figure out how to push back against that very linear valuation that just solves for the harm caused and the cost of breach notification. And so when we solve for how to value data and make it generalizable and acceptable, it could show up on balance sheets of publicly quoted companies, but it could also show up in how damages are ascribed. So that good conduct is then not just an issue we try to do through public indignation, but we do it because it's priced into these types of systems. So that to me is the very biggest gap when it comes to data and the valuation and the types of risks that the insurance industry typically look at, but it's very linear today.
Very literally the biggest gap too. Very well said, Dante there. So now pivoting to Dave, you had an initial comment as well for Daniel's comments.
I did, Daniel. Maybe picking up on the first half of your comments. It's without going too deeply into this topic, we're making a lot of investments this year into what is the next one of the next big innovation frontiers of confidential compute and secure multi-party private, whatever labels you want to put on it. I think we're zeroing in on some language as an industry, but the whole notion of being able to to be able to work with encrypted data without decrypting it, and just some of the powerful dimensions of being able to, we're now starting to see the first instances of being able to apply these concepts at more scale. And there's a variety of architectural patterns to do it. And one of the things that we've been spending time on is what is the combination of confidential compute plus digital identity wallets enable? And not, I'm not making this comment from what I think is a big challenge always, right? Is the innovator's enthusiasm of I can solve that problem, right? With tech, I've got the solution, right? That's not why I'm raising it. But what I would love to see more of is I don't see that we have enough of the policy dialogue that I think, even Dante, you just referenced around what is it that we want and value as a society around the policies, around those use cases of whether it's law enforcement having access for a criminal pursuit, or I show up unconscious in the emergency room and want my cell phone to be able to be open to figure out blood type and medical information, or lost child, or the variety of use cases. I think we would all benefit from that interplay of the innovator's enthusiasm of what's the next wave of technical possibility, because there are really incredible possibilities coming, with the proactive policy discussions around how might we apply them. I think we do one or the other, or we do one too late and the other too early. I think our ability to rethink how we get these communities to come together to say what societal choices would we make for policy and law and regulation, and then juxtapose that against what the technologists are coming up with on an innovation perspective.
Well said. All right, I'm now going to go to Arena and then also Richard Lum. If you could both ask your questions, and then we'll go back to the discussants for their thoughts. So maybe Arena, if you're willing to ask your question, please.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I apologize. I hate it when people do comments instead of questions, but this really is more of a comment. It took us a long time to get to where people in the chat were saying that all technologies, so including this one, are dual use. And if we acknowledge that, then we should be talking from the very beginning about the dual uses. And we should be thinking about how this might cause harm and who would be the people who would be harmed and what do we do about that. If we just talk about the benefits, even to those most vulnerable, we're really missing a key part of the conversation. And I'm struck that we're still talking about data being oil when, again, I didn't come up with this, but I've definitely heard people talking about it, personal data, which is what we're talking about here, as being more like radioactive material. It has benefits and it has very potentially bad consequences. And how do you protect that rather than oil is the question here, right? So I would like, I guess, all of the folks who have presented so far to kind of address those aspects. And I would add the interoperability also means that you're creating one giant honeypot in this case, right?
Very well said. So I'll take your question and I'll go to Richard, and then we'll do one more before we circle back. So Richard, if you could go next.
Hey, good afternoon. Richard here, stuck in Honolulu, so I'm sorry.
That's not a bad place to be.
and truly, I apologize if it's overly naive idea, but Dave had been talking and somebody else had mentioned or commented previously about identities and how, we don't necessarily want to wrap all identities into one single access point. And of course, we do have in life multiple identities. Those identities arise from different communities, different functions that we hold in life. They have different rules and norms and reasons and times when you need to access them. So as Dave was talking earlier, it just sort of popped into my head. Could you could somebody actually conceive of a system where you built an identity platform, some set of standards or something, but identity was modular, and thus everybody played in that ecosystem, so they were interoperability. But, you know, and in my mind, it was very much that idea of, as you moved from one interaction in life to a different one, you know, you interacting with those systems, some of those identities get stripped out because they don't need access to that stuff. Other ones get called in because that's what they're looking for. Anyway, it was a notion that popped into my head. Entirely possible because I was looking at the Lego bricks behind Dave and his wonderful little Razor's Crest. Anyway, thank you.
Excellent. All right, we'll do one more question, then I'll circle back to the discussants. Tanya, you also had a question that you asked to. Tanya, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. We talked quite a bit about the risk of, about the privacy issues of the digital identity, but I would like to hear a little bit discussion on the security risk, especially with the recent hacking of the US government. And, you know, it may be these days even bigger, in many ways, an even bigger risk than the privacy.
All right, so if I could circle back to the panelists, and Sheila, I'm gonna go to you first, then Dakota, then Dave, then Dante, so the same order that we did in the past. What I hear is we hear one, could we be talking about how this is dual use and talking about the harms, recognizing that may be nuclear material. Richard asked a question about, can we solve this with modularity, and could we have that be an approach? And then Tanya's question of, not only is it nuclear material, but it's nuclear material that some nation states may wanna actually seize for themselves. So with that, Sheila, you get to solve those fun challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just gonna kind of put down, you know, my general view on the world, which is, yeah, all those things are true, all those things are hard, all those things are threats, you know, to varying degrees, and I'm gonna kind of let others, Dogat in particular, address some of the cybersecurity and other kinds of implications. But I think this is exactly why this issue is so important. It's exactly why I think we need to proceed. And again, not to, you know, I was kind of laughing when Dave was going into the WEF speak, but I actually really do believe that foundational premise that you really do need to have a multitude of geographies, a multitude of stakeholders, industry, government, civil society organizations like invested in this thing, in this solution. And it can't be something that is controlled by any one institution, whether that's a public or private sector institution is in my mind somewhat irrelevant because each of those have their own biases and agendas, right? The other thing that I kind of put in the chat here is someone had noted, I forget, can't find anything in the chat. It's a very robust chat. But, you know, I can't, someone had noted that, you know, basically the tech is a neutral concept. And, you know, I push back on that as a general matter because, you know, certainly tech can be used for good or evil, as most things in life can be used or deployed for good or evil. But what we know is that, you know, we just think about the obvious bias built into algorithms, and many, many scholars who are way more qualified than I am have pointed this out in extensive research studies. At the same, why would we think the same would be true for anything as foundational and fundamental as a digital identity solution? I mean, the biases we bake into that and what the use are going to be predicated on the use cases that we are imagining, and we are the builders are imagining that it's going to actually unroll to support, and so, or be unveiled to support. And so, not taking it back a level and focusing on really this is a foundational layer that's both in terms of identity layer and a tech stack, but also I think more importantly, and others of my colleagues have talked about this too, the governance piece of this. Because again, as we've said, I think as you've heard all of us say, the discussants here, the tech is not the hard part. The governance is, as this is usually the case, the governance is the really, really hard part. And if we're building this in silos and we're governing it, you know, in silos, even if you make those silos ultimately interoperable, you're still missing, you know, the opportunity to build something that is truly foundational and at its core reflects an opportunity to build a system that is more equitable, which in my mind should always be the goal.
Well said. All right, Dakota, Dave, and then Dante, and then we're going to do one more set of questions before we close back to the discussants to wrap. So Dakota.
Great. I mean, I think just picking up on, you know, Sheila's last points, you know, what this requires is sustained collaboration. You know, it requires a critical mass of organizations who first, I think, agree on the principles and norms around digital ID. And, you know, what is it that we are trying to do? What, you know, what defines good digital ID and what defines bad digital ID? And I think, Arina, to your point, and I realized sort of as panelists, I think we jumped straight into talking about sort of user managed digital ID. without acknowledging that there's a whole world of digital ID solutions that are being put forward that provide much, much less control to individuals over their information. And so, I actually wanted to just pause and note that the model of digital ID that all of us are talking about today, where individuals do have the ability to manage and control their own data, where that data remains at source, where you can follow practices of data minimization. It's our general belief. I think I speak for everyone that from a privacy perspective is doesn't negate the privacy risks, but certainly helps to mitigate some of them. But it's not a given. It's not a given that this is the model of digital ID that we're going to see move forward. And so I think really what is incumbent on all of us who care about this topic is putting that stake in the ground and saying digital ID can be tremendously transformative. There are real risks associated with it. We're not blind to that. But we have to go and sort of create the best model of digital ID that we can. And again, that's a critical mass on principles and norms. It's a critical mass of organizations agreeing to a set of technical standards. And I think ultimately it's a critical mass of organizations who then adopt this so that there's real utility to individuals. And you get to the point where you can share these credentials as you navigate the world.
And can I just chime in really quickly to add to Dakota's point? Like, this isn't something, it is so important to get this right, because no matter, even if it's wrong, it's wildfire. Like, it's going to take off, right? This isn't the kind of thing you can just be like, oops, and then you kind of do it again. Like, it doesn't work that way. This is foundational enough, or period, that we really do have to, there's a lot of pressure, I think, and a lot of it's critical basically to do this better and to get it right.
All right, we're going to go to Dave, then Dante, then Esther for a quick comment, because you had a perspective from ICANN before we go then to Nikhil, Divya, and Scott David for closing questions. So Dave, over to you.
Yeah, I guess trying to add, be creative here. Maybe to draw out a couple more aspects of the pattern that's emerged around self-managed ID that are critically important to understand, as different from what as a provocation, I would almost separate the world of there is the incremental innovation of the current model, meaning I need to look to someone to host my identity, and I need to trust them and their ability to manage a firewall, and that they're going to do good things, not bad, with that information. I'm trusting an agent to be my access point and to host my data for me and to be the validator of it. There's tremendous innovation still to go in that space, but I'm going to provocatively call that incremental innovation on the existing model. And what's critically important is that we get more and more people up to speed on this potential of self-managed model, because I can even infer from some of the questions that there's not a uniform understanding in the group here, that what Dakota's describing is a model that's emerged, again, based on the W3C standard and a whole work that's crystallized over the past few years. The whole notion that I can, in my individual relationships with an individual authority and an individual service provider, collect a verifiable credential from just that part of the relationship, so that over time I'm accumulating everything and I hold everything. They each only hold the facet they need to provide that level of service or access or whatever it is that they need in order to, based on my relationship. And based on this construct, for the first time ever, we have the ability to revoke access or time limit it. I can say, I want to give you access to this piece of information to allow me to do something with you, and you're going to have it for 15 minutes, and then actually the ability to revoke access. And we don't have time to go through the technicals of how that works, but that is what's in front of us. Is now there's no agency that holds all of it. There's only the individual relationships and that ability for the user to control that relationship and say, look, I don't want it anymore and I'm going to revoke. And so, if what I'm saying is not, if I'm not preaching to the choir, really go out and take a look at a lot of, what's been going on with that pattern that's crystallized and the people that are out there that are building against this open standard. Like I said earlier, this is the basis of Hyperledger India, the Linux project, Hyperledger India and Aries. It's based on the W3C standard, the Decentralized Identity Foundation. This plays into then that security question. Right, the security then, is now that threat surface is vastly different right? If someone wants to attack a group, much more like you have to attack the individuals, right? If someone wants to attack the individual, it's the nature of the cryptography and the nature of the segregation of that data and the ability to use it is a much more difficult threat surface. And so again, this is the enthusiasm of the innovator, and I recognize that, and I'll go back to a pragmatic lens, but fully understanding the possibility of what the technology can do is critically important because it is powerful, but we're talking past each other in a lot of different domains around not understanding how to apply it and then raising the appropriate policy and regulatory choice questions around it.
Very well said, and I think that does point to something that may also be useful that maybe this group could do in the first 100 days of the new administration is putting this in front of them, because I agree with you. I think a lot of people don't understand it yet, and especially as you said, why do people rob banks? That's because where the money is. If we can go to this new model where all the money's not in one place, then these threats where we see where there's massive data thefts are not present. So thank you, Dave, for that. Dante, your chance, and then we'll go to Esther after Dante.
Yeah, sure. So I think building off of David and Dakota's remarks, the idea of, the worst spectrum of our thought when you talk about technology and new things is we always go to the extreme. So when you talk about AI, people think of the Terminator as the end game. And when you talk about blockchain and digital currencies and these types of ideas, and you think about complete circumvention and disintermediation of traditional systems, when in reality, it's a little bit more gradual. Think about what electric vehicles are doing in challenging the internal combustion engine, a dominant technology that has had a 100+ year head start. It doesn't kill mobility. It just gives you a better way to move around, or at least additional optionality on how you move around. And I think the same holds true for the digital identity conversation, that we ought to spur a principled competitive standards war and let the winner, the one that the market trusts and that people trust and that regulators ultimately trust, be that force. And I think the work that Dakota is doing with ID 2020 and helping normalize the conversation is about introducing this as part of the optionality we have to have. Because the problem of a billion people in the world without access to nationally issued IDs that work and that are interoperable from I can clear a border point of view is a fundamentally flawed, heavily risky world. So I would argue to anybody in the audience that has this end state, this draconian, terrible end state in mind, think about the current state. The current state doesn't work, and it doesn't work for billions of people, and it doesn't work for hundreds of millions of people. And many of the very biggest economies in the world labor under these very issues themselves. COVID-19 has proven it, and the post-COVID world of healthcare assurance that is high trust and allows us to go back to any semblance of normal. These types of ID conversations are requisite to getting back to some degree of normal. And so the failure to innovate and failure to move isn't really a particularly good option.
Well said. All right, Esther, you had a comment that you wanted to add on to folks, and then we'll go to Nikhil for his question.
Okay, I mean, I could talk forever, but very briefly, I was chairman of ICANN, and the first one, and what Dante just said, there is no endpoint. We just are going to keep moving. You read science fiction and they've solved it, but the challenges are we're trying to solve too many problems at the same time. One is access. Another is protecting your data if you have access and you want to protect your data. But the real problem is governance. You can do anything you like, but the rest of the world needs to agree to play by your rules. And the challenge is setting up a governance that can't be, ICANN was supposed to keep governments out, and it ended up letting the private sector in and became basically a protection racket, where rather than multiple identities, people buy hundreds of domain names because they need to protect their Coca-Cola trademark or whatever it is. And I just see a world where you have all these different competing entities and you have a whole lot of people making money off it, and they're the governance structure. Or I see a world where China's the governance structure, and I don't really like either of those. And at the same time, you need some kind of multilateral agreement somewhere. And I agree with Dante. I don't think we're going to figure this out during the Biden administration. I hope we'll move a little further, but I think we need to be practical and also realistic about how much we can fix all the problems of the world just with technology.
Well, and I think, and I really appreciate what you said, Esther, that you hit the nail on the head. And if I could real quick say, I mean, that is one of the core pillars of the Geotech Center, is recognizing that technology means that things that used to be exclusively the purview of government aren't. And there are disproportionate things that now the private sector can do, but not everyone is empowered equally, which puts the onus on us thinking about how do we make this happen and how do we effectively govern at a speed that's never been done before. And like you said, China's got a really great model. You just don't ask for input, but that's not what we're looking for. And so, you know, I heard Dave give the same call that the World Economic Forum does, which is everyone talks about multi-stakeholder, but multi-stakeholder is very messy. And so we've got to figure out how to do that. And so on that happy note, we'll go to Nikhil, then Divya, and then Scott David for your questions and comments. So Nikhil?
Yeah, actually, my question is quite related to what you just brought up, David. In the world where we're seeing and having to think more about the role of private sector in place of public sector and policy, kind of curious to think, and I think Claire touched on this on one of her earlier comments, is how can private sector organizations, particularly startups, operationally make sure identities reach all people, and how can they actually challenge a model where organizations in power, where it's such an asymmetric playing field, particularly when you look at public and large private sector organizations, how can they make sure that those types of organizations aren't demanding data for crucial services that are really just kind of seen as essential, and navigate that when you're thinking about kind of a sovereign identity?
All right, great question. So we'll definitely incorporate that. And then Divya, you had a question, comment as well?
Yeah, more of a comment. And this is a really great conversation. There's almost too much to comment on. Maybe I'll just try to focus on sort of an interplay between what I think his name is Richard Lum said about talking about modular digital identity sharing, and many of the comments that Dave Treat was making about how you enable use cases. And I think the thing that I wanted to say is that one of the problems we're running into is that the current internet wasn't really designed to support this kind of digital sharing, right? It wasn't really meant for this type of transaction and commerce. It was originally meant for scientists to share data. And because we have this peculiarity of addressing everything by the device it sits on, we actually run into a lot of limitations in terms of how we secure and share data. There are other network architectures out there that have been developed. One is called the Name Data Network, and it actually addresses content by name, and it can sit upon like the current internet architecture. And why it's powerful and sort of powerful for this conversation is that it does several things. One, it enables data producers to actually specify, because their content is named, how and when their data can be shared because it's requested by a verified data consumer. And that's really similar to this idea. So, you know, this use case idea that there is sort of a generalized set of IRBs like we have at universities where you say, oh, I'm going to share my medical data for this particular thing because I believe in it. And I give you a fiduciary responsibility to care for my data in this circumstance. And it also enables data to be interoperable for some of the many use cases, which then allows it to be modular because you don't necessarily have to give away all data that is produced by a single data producer in order to validate it for that particular use case. And then finally, it enables us to decentralize data, keep it in a decentralized manner, and you know, not have to constantly aggregate it in order to make sense of it.
Excellent. I appreciate it, Divya. We're going to go to Scott, and then we're going to try to get to Sheila before she has a reboot at 10 minutes in. So if we lose Sheila, we know, but go ahead, Scott, your turn.
Okay. I guess the only thing I would share, this is great. This is so fantastic. Thank you. Love it. Happy holidays, everyone. And the thing I would share here is, I think a lot of this is, we got Moore's law going on here, but it's the fifth order effect of Moore's law, which I think I've talked about before. The Moore's law, everyone knows, doubling of transistor densities on chips every 18 months. The fifth order effect of that is an exponential increase in risk, in interactions globally, not just digitized interactions, but interactions. And interactions, as any engineer or lawyer will tell you, are risky because if they go not according to what you thought, you have a problem. And so I think part of what we have here is we have all these things that are happening, these shifts in power, these shifts in the computing power, et cetera, and we're revisiting human power here. And the human power, all of these existing institutions are our creation. Nothing fell from the sky, right? Deities and royalty and countries and companies are all our creation. They're all our projections. And right now we're starting to project out, looking at these computational sovereign possibilities. What are they good for? What can they do for us? But it's all about that humanness. And so I think I've come full circle now that, and this is the last point, the governance of identity here is really the governance of ourselves. This is not going to be the governance of identity systems. It's going to be governing ourselves, because identity is bound up in language and material culture, like other consciousness. I believe the mind is in language and material culture, and the brain is tuned by education to that mind. Sounds freaky, but think about colonial schools, right? So here, our governance of identity to work on, the reason it's so hard is we're trying to think of how to govern ourselves. So I'll leave that as a nice holiday thing, because it's a lot of efficacy bound up in that for the type of things we're doing here. This is not bad and threatening. This is a marvelous historical opportunity for folks like us, and having an opportunity to work with folks like all of you on this kind of problem is the greatest gift and pleasure I can ever imagine. So thank you and happy holiday.
Thank you, Scott. And I think, Sheila, you have a real quick chance. And I think he opened with how you open, which is maybe the way that makes it so hard is this is about not just digital identity, but identity of ourselves and governing ourselves. So Sheila,
you know, I think there's a lot of interesting scholarship coming out on just the idea of digital personhood. And so I don't want to go down that whole rabbit hole, but it is definitely worth bringing in, at least touching upon in the conversation here. But Divya, you know, to your point about different data models and kind of like how we can actually start to segregate out, or modularize is another way of putting it, sure, why not? There's a lot of different terms I suppose we could use, that not all data is the same. And so, and not all uses of data are the same. And so I may be very comfortable, to your point, with genomic data about me being used for COVID-19 purposes, but not to create like foundation that matches my skin tone, right? Like because I feel very differently about who's going to be using the data and for what, and kind of how it's going to be encrypted, things like this that are really important. And so I do think we have to create a narrative shift. And we're working on this at the forum. It's actually a core part of the initiatives under my purview. To change the narrative here, and this is happening like in the data space, but it's not happening in the broader society. And so what we want to do is kind of bring this awareness that most of us on this call have, to the idea that we need to be shifting away from data as something that can be captured and controlled and seized and protected even, and towards more of the notion that with new models of encryption, you know, with new access rights that can be granted using new technologies, we can provide more agency to data subjects. And that, I think, fundamentally should be the departure point for a lot of things we're doing, including the conversation we're having here today. But thank you all. This has really been a wonderful and interesting conversation.
Excellent. And Dakota, I'm going to go to you, and then Dave and Dante for the closing words. So Dakota?
You know, I don't think there's any way to kind of neatly tie up the many threads of conversation we've had today. So, you know, I think really would just say that it's, you know, it's daily a privilege to work with so many of the people who are here on this call, you know, both the discussants as well as many of the people who have joined. And it's, as people have said, this is hard, but it's not impossible. And you know, I think we sort of have a clear opportunity ahead of us, you know, and I think COVID actually provides, you know, a basis on which to accelerate some of this work, but to do so in a really careful and very thoughtful way. And so just, you know, pleased to be with all of you.
And I might say for everyone here that maybe if Stephen is interested, we may circle back to you as part of, again, of course, we'll ask for your permission to do a recap of this session, and folks that want to keep things non-attribution, we can. But it may actually be that we could use everything that came out of here to tee up something as a memo to the new administration for their first 100 days. So that actually could be an action that comes out of this. With that, Dave, and then Dante for the close, please.
You're brilliant to end with, Dante. I can't, you know, he's always the most eloquent to wrap up these kinds of things. So I'm glad you flipped that around. I suppose I would just I'll echo in the thanks and appreciation for this group, and the lean in and the quality of the questions and interaction is fantastic. Again, just from an innovator's enthusiasm, I'm wildly passionate about the space. And I think that's kind of fun, because that community exists of some really passionate technologists who are thinking through how to give how to add more optionality to the dialogue. And I'm also got a ton of hope that when we take, I think, a giant step back years from now and look at this particular period, I think we are in fact at an incredibly privileged moment to be able to redefine. We're redefining money, we're redefining identity, we're redefining, I think, the next phase of what the digital world is all about, right? It's not two-dimensional on a flat screen and agency-based. It's it's immersive, and it's much more in our control. I feel, I think we're all incredibly privileged to be here, here at this moment with this optionality. And if we keep having these kinds of societal, social, political, regulatory, legal discussions around what good looks like, I think we'll be fine. So I'm excited and hopeful, and then obviously agree with all of the content, all of the comments around the caution and the dangers and the risks. But I'm much more excited and hopeful.
Very well said. Thank you, Dave. Dante, you get to bring it home for us.
Well, thank you, David. It's a tall order because this has been really one of the more fascinating conversations I've had this year on Zoom. So I'm very appreciative to the Atlantic Council, to David, and to Dakota and Sheila as fellow panelists tonight. I guess if I were to sum up, the message would be, at the nexus of technology, policy, and human need, this question of digital identity is at the center of it, right? That if you want to pull billions of people into financial access, into fundamental access, into identity and authentication, civic engagement, think about the fact that to exercise your civic duty in this year's election, so many people had to wait in line, notwithstanding social distancing and quarantine requirements, that the absence of a digital safe way of exercising your civic duty is one of those vulnerabilities for which digital identity is a game changer. It's the gateway to onboarding into the 21st century. So we should encourage radical experimentation in this domain, despite the risks, and that to do nothing also is a risk in its own right. So with that, I want to say thanks again to you, David, and to the Atlantic Council for the great opportunity.
Very well said. And I think that actually is a very actionable thing we can include in a memo that we could do to go forward. Stephen, I don't know if you have any closing words, because you've been co-host and co-partner in making this happen.
It's so kind. I know we're beyond time, and this has just been a lovely conversation. I thank all the brilliant people on this call for that. I think there's a few key takeaways that I synthesized from this, which is one, there's just tremendous opportunity in digital identity. I think any of us who have been close to that field have seen this for a long time and are really encouraged by what we're seeing. But there's also a need for a primer, especially if we're looking at, a note to lawmakers about what digital ID is and what it is not. Mm-hmm. And I think that education component, which we've seen in data ethics as well, is just profoundly important. And one of the other things I think is really encouraging, point number 2, is that there are groups that digital identity is built for. And this time we're giving a lot of attention to the billion-plus people who typically aren't represented in these conversations. And I think that's something that is really encouraging. And something that we deserve to pat ourselves on the back for. But I think there's also a lot of niche stakeholders who are not at the table. And I think that's something where we can improve as well. And to really kind of explore, what some of those safeguards that are more universal we might want to have in place. And where do we want to kind of, what does that checklist look like for things that we should be concerned about? And then, the last thing is that today, we can see technology sometimes as a gateway to involvement in civic life. For instance, how many times do we have to first log into Facebook before we can see details about a municipal event, for instance? We want to avoid that here, right? We don't want to have digital identity being a limiting factor. We want to have it being an enabling factor and providing agency for those who may not have had agency in certain areas before. And I think that kind of brings us back full circle to the first point as well. So I'm really encouraged. I love this conversation. I do think there's tremendous opportunity, for the Atlantic Council to have influence here. And I do believe that governments are open to it if we can educate them about it in a generative way.
Excellent. And with that said, we want to thank you all for joining us. Thank you for going a little bit over. In the next year ahead, we'll work together on carrying this forward with the Data Salon series. As always, be bold, be brave, be benevolent. Thank you.